Hey there, visual economic community. As we saw in a previous video that we've linked for you in the description, Western economies could be about to face a new major crisis. A type of crisis where, at the same time that employment is being destroyed, inflation is skyrocketing. I am referring, of course, to a new stagflation crisis.
Stagflation is the greatest threat to Europe's recovery, warns ex-Italian PM Monti.
Surely this type of phenomenon will ring a bell for many of you because of the famous oil crisis of the 1970s. However, take note. If a similar crisis were to occur today, it could be far worse than virtually any previous crisis. In contrast to the oil crisis era, public and private indebtedness in Western economies is very high. Here, we're talking about families with mortgages, companies with loans, and of course, governments with their gigantic public debts. To be specific, the huge debt figure currently being bandied about is, hold on to your seat, around 425% of GDP. But why is this a major problem? And why could it be the trigger for a huge new recession? Well, as we explained in the previous video, if you want to fight inflation like the one that we are currently experiencing, one of the few methods available to the governments is precisely to raise interest rates. If that were to happen, families, companies, and governments would have to pay higher monthly payments at the end of each month due to the debts they have. In a context of economic recession, many may no longer be able to pay. In other words, we could enter a cycle of defaults that could be the precedent of a new financial cataclysm, a financial catastrophe, comparable to that of the 2008 crisis. So yes, it's no joke. We are talking about not only stagflation, as in the 1970s, but also a severe credit crunch. In other words, we would have a combination of the two biggest economic crises since the Second World War. But let's slow down for a moment. What exactly is stagflation? What causes it? Do we have any real indications that it is actually going to happen? Well, in this video, we will answer these questions, but first, let's get into a bit of history. Here's a question. Which conflict would you say marked the history of the 1970s in the United States? No doubt many of you will think instantly of the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. However, if we're talking about military conflicts that Uncle Sam was involved in during the 1970s, let me tell you that Vietnam was far from the only one. What's more, there was another war whose consequences, at least economically, were even worse than the Vietnamese War. I'm talking about the Yom Kippur War. In October 1973, just a few years after the Six-Day War in which Israel conquered the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, Arab troops wanted to take revenge and regain the lost territory. To this end, in an operation led by Egypt and Syria, they decided to launch a surprise attack on the Israelis on Yom Kippur, the holiest day for the Jews. With this surprise attack, the Arabs crossed the ceasefire line established 6 years earlier, and in a lightning strike that lasted 3 days, they recaptured the Sinai Peninsula unopposed. Of course, the Israelis, who had the support of the United States, were not going to sit idly by. So in a counterattack of less than a week's duration, they not only pushed back the Arab forces, but also managed to invade Syria, bombard Damascus, and surround the Egyptian city of Suez. Finally, in order to prevent an escalation of war between the United States and the USSR, the United Nations intervened to sign a new ceasefire. So what does all of this have to do with stagflation? Well, although the Yom Kippur War lasted little more than 2 weeks, it was a terrible humiliation for the Arab world. And do you think that they would give in without retaliating against their rivals? Evidently not. In response to the Yom Kippur humiliation, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, led mainly by Middle Eastern countries, established an embargo on oil trade to the United States. You could say that this is something similar to what would happen if Russia were to turn off the gas tap to Europe. And you may be thinking, so what were the consequences of this massive OPEC oil embargo for the US? The answer is that overnight, oil went from being cheap and accessible to everyone to being extremely expensive and scarce. Basically, the oil shortage was so severe that there were days when it was simply not possible to fill up at gas stations. There simply wasn't enough gas for everyone. To give you an idea of the level of the embargo suffered at the time, US imports from Arab countries went from 1.2 million barrels of oil per day to a mere 19,000 barrels. In other words, the Yankees lost about 99% of the supply they received from the Arab countries, whilst also witnessing the price of a barrel of oil multiply by 4. Knowing all of this, let me ask a new question. What do you think happens when the price of something as basic as oil skyrockets? Well, the price of everything that uses oil also skyrockets. Food, industry, transportation, all of them use oil at some stage of their production, and with higher production costs, it follows that the final products also become more expensive. However, if this were not enough, the truth is that the state's political interventions did not help to remedy the situation either. In an effort to curb the rising price of dinosaur juice, the Nixon administration approved a cap on the price of old oil. That is, oil that has already been extracted and was in reserves. And I ask you, what do you think the vendors did when faced with this limitation? They decided to withdraw all the old oil from the market, as it could no longer be sold at a high price, and to sell only the newly extracted oil, which had no limitations whatsoever. This ironically caused the supply of oil to be even smaller, and of course, the price of oil to rise even more. You know, politics. The fact is that this price increase reached such a peak that inflation rates of more than 10% were recorded. And unlike other inflation crises experienced in the past, in this case, while prices continued to rise, wages remained unchanged. What's more, due to the lack of competitiveness of American industry caused by rising costs, many people lost their jobs, so that the unemployment rate almost doubled from 4.9% to 9.7%. VisualEconomik fans, after this great oil debacle, economists around the world were forced to rewrite their textbooks. After the crisis of the 1970s, they realized that a scenario combining inflation and unemployment was entirely possible, something that, as we saw in the previous video, had seemed impossible up until that point. This new scenario was dubbed stagflation. Knowing this, you're probably asking yourself some questions. Why was it possible to have inflation and unemployment at the same time during the oil crisis? Why is this not the case in other known crises, such as the 2008 financial crisis? Summarized, what happened in the 2008 crisis was the following. Overnight, the real estate bubble burst. Banks ran out of liquidity and stopped lending. Without loans, people stopped buying houses, and general consumption fell. And when people stopped consuming, prices fell, and many workers lost their jobs. However, in a stagflation crisis, just the opposite happens. First, there is a shortage of a key commodity, for example, oil. After that, prices rise across the board. And as a result, given the reduced purchasing power of families as a result of inflation, many workers end up losing their jobs. In summary, what caused the 2008 crisis was a demand shock, while what caused the oil crisis was a supply shock. Hence, stagflation is possible. Now, before some monetarists get nervous, the supply shock theory is not the only one that explains stagflation. Moreover, there is another theory that suggests that governments are really to blame for stagflation. Check it out.
Monetary overheating.
One of the alternative hypotheses to the supply shock theory is that stagflation crises could be caused by the monetary and fiscal policies of governments, that is, printing money and increasing public spending. According to this theory, the oil crisis of the 1970s would not have been the real cause of stagflation at the time, but only a factor that helped to worsen it. Although, if so, how exactly could monetary expansion cause stagflation? The answer given by this hypothesis is that printing money could cause a widespread short-term economic boost that generates more employment than an economy actually needs. However, upon reaching the long term, and when the economy stabilizes again after the main impulse, all that extraordinary employment created through monetary doping simply disappears, resulting in a situation where unemployment and inflation would grow at the same rate. But how plausible is this theory, and does it really fit the data? Well, whether it is more or less true, what is certain is that the 1970s were years marked by the collapse of the Bretton Woods Pact, by an enormous drop in confidence in the dollar, and by monetary expansions that combined to reduce interest rates to less than 8%. So both the supply shock theory and the overheating theory seemed to fit the story perfectly. In any case, the important thing now is to answer a more topical question. Are we again, in 2022, facing a situation similar to that experienced in the 1970s? Is it really possible that stagflation will return? Honestly, and not to be a prophet of doom, the truth is that after the reactions of the world governments to the coronavirus crisis, everything indicates that today we are experiencing exactly the same thing, or at least as far as monetary expansion is concerned. To fight the coronavirus pandemic, the US Federal Reserve printed more than $8 trillion in order to finance large fiscal stimulus packages. This is 10 times more than what was done to counter the 2008 financial crisis. To make matters worse, there is an additional problem that must be taken into account, and that is that the COVID recovery was much more rapid than anyone anticipated. What this means is that the stimulus packages may have been even more excessive than they would appear at first glance. And if I may say so, that's a pretty expensive first glance. Be that as it may, this is what has been happening in the United States, and to a lesser extent, in Europe over the last few years. What is even more worrying is that from the end of February 2022, we must add a new ingredient to the recipe of stagflation. And yes, I'm talking about Mother Russia. It is a fact that in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the price of a multitude of commodities has skyrocketed. Diesel oil has reached over €2 per litre in several European countries. The rise in natural gas costs has led to an increased energy costs in countries like Spain, where the price of electricity has been up to 14 times higher than in 2021. And of course, let's not forget foodstuffs such as wheat, which have seen their price increase by 40% in a matter of days. It is not that supply shock is imminent, it is that we are already experiencing it on our own doorsteps. This, coupled with the potential monetary overheating resulting from the pandemic, poses an ideal scenario for stagflation. In Europe, in 2022, the perfect ingredients are brewing. Be that as it may, there is a need for calm, to wait and see how the conflict develops, to study whether there are alternatives to Russian supplies, and whether an early peace is possible. It's still too early to talk, and we economists are certainly not psychics. So at this point, it's your turn. Do you think that the war in Ukraine will end up bringing us a new era of stagflation? Do you think that central banks were leading us to it anyway? Do you think that a possible solution to the debt problem would be the perpetual bonds that we explained in a previous video? Leave us your answers below in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here on VisualEconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell so that you don't miss any of our updates. If you liked this video, like it, and I'll see you in the next one. All the best. See you next time.